Wade in the water. Wade in the water. Wade in the water. God's gonna trouble the water.
African Americans in North Carolina sought to educate themselves well before the state had developed a formal system of public schooling. Immediately after the Civil War, former slaves cooperated with missionary societies and the federal government's Freedmen's Bureau to establish small schools. In these schools, thousands of youth and adults learned to read and write. A visiting missionary observed, "In the midst of pinching want, amounting almost to starvation, freedmen seemed more anxious for schools than for food." During Reconstruction, black politicians played a leading role in establishing North Carolina's first constitutional guarantee of public education. These provisions applied to all children, regardless of race. Yet in subsequent decades, the South's emerging public schools would reflect and reinforce the development of Jim Crow, the region's racial caste system that lasted for more than half a century. North Carolina's Jim Crow schools adhered to a triracial caste system. There were separate schools for whites, there were separate schools for blacks, and there were separate schools for Indians. Lawmakers created these separate schools alongside legal provisions that purportedly upheld educational equality. The state constitution read, "The children of the white race and the colored race shall be taught in separate public schools, but there shall be no discrimination in favor of or to the prejudice of either race." Such pledges rang especially hollow after 1898, when whites used violence and intimidation to strip African Americans of their legal and political rights. With total control of state and local governments, white North Carolinians launched a school building campaign for their own children. At the same time, funding to black and Indian schools declined. Minority children in the Jim Crow period attended facilities with grossly inadequate materials. In 1919, an African American teacher from Gastonia said of her school, "There is no place for the children to get drinking water, there are no desks of account, and a scarcity of books for the children. This one-room building for about 175 children has just a medium-sized wood stove and no other conveniences in the world." Indeed, in 1919, the property value of the average white school in North Carolina was 4 times greater than the value of each black school. In the face of discriminatory school funding, African Americans in North Carolina drew upon their own limited resources and sought the assistance of distant philanthropists. With the assistance of a private philanthropy known as the Jeans Fund, hundreds of so-called Jeans teachers traveled across the state teaching black children the 3 R's. They also taught essential skills that helped feed and clothe impoverished black families. With grants from the Chicago-based Rosenwald Fund, African Americans launched a campaign to replace dilapidated schools with new and more modern facilities. By the early 1930s, black North Carolinians had built over 800 Rosenwald schools. Despite such efforts, black schools still suffered from meager school funds. They routinely had to furnish their schools with cast-off textbooks and worn desks. Durham newspaper editor Lewis Austin assailed those inequalities in 1937, charging whites with what he termed the educational rape of the Negro. Limited by their material circumstances, black parents and educators nonetheless labored tirelessly to create supportive learning environments. At Chapel Hill's Lincoln High, students drew inspiration from teachers and administrators who countered the prevailing racism of the day with lessons in Black pride and achievement. Student Thurman Couch found a particularly inspiring role model in Principal Charles A. McDougall.
He made it feel like he wanted to be somebody. Every morning I walked in Lincoln High School, I walked in there proud. I look forward to hearing what they're going to do. And if you was late, he would say, "You're too late for the day and too early for tomorrow."
Students at Lincoln High also rallied behind their award-winning band and sports teams and used those activities to demonstrate their racial pride to the larger community.
The band was the pride, the heart and soul of the school. You know what the band did on Christmas, to see your own people march down Franklin Street with the best band in the whole county? To be able to run rings around the kids down the street who got all the new equipment and everything. That was exciting.
Although African Americans had built hundreds of nurturing school communities like the one at Lincoln High, resource inequalities endured. In the 1940s and 1950s, Black parents and students organized campaigns and protests for school equalization. With assistance from the state's growing chapters of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, some African Americans filed equalization lawsuits against local school boards. In an attempt to discourage Black litigation efforts and to preserve segregation, the state began to narrow the educational spending gap in the decade before Brown. Yet, on the eve of the landmark 1954 ruling, separate and unequal remained the norm. A colleague of Principal J.W. Mask was denied even the most basic of supplies.
He had 600 or 700 students, and this was in the Goldsboro district. He called the superintendent, told him they needed some toilet tissue. He said, well, he gave them 6 rolls of toilet tissue. He said, now if you need any more, say let them use newspaper. Say that's what they use at home. That's right. Beck is right. I mean, not some superintendents, and I hate to say this, sort of wanted to run the school systems as they would a plantation, like give the slaves enough to survive on, and don't provide them too much by way of elevating the experiences or expanding opportunities.
In the face of such indignities, African Americans pressed the cause of educational equality and continuously sought better resources for their schools. But many Black leaders insisted that, no matter the level of resources, segregated schools would always engender larger divisions and exclusions within society. Within segregated schools, African Americans prepared themselves for careers, only to be turned away from well-paying trades and professional jobs. Within segregated schools, African Americans developed leadership skills, only to find the official world of politics and government reserved for whites. Thus, in the 1950s, African Americans had begun to challenge segregated school laws, not simply because of enduring resource inequalities. They hoped that integrated schools would offer a model for how all of Southern society might be transformed.
In the water.